All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Now, before we get into the book, I was watching Demolition Man recently, and it's like got a pretty good like red pill or even like normie pill in there. And this first scene with Sandra Bullock when they go into the police station or whatever, it's just hilarious because it's like all the guys in the police force are just doing their job, having a great time at work. Everything's running smoothly. There's no problems. There's no crime. All the guys are happy. And then you go into her office and she's like, you know what's really missing around here? A bunch of guys fighting each other. Everything would be going so much better if y'all were fighting each other. Because all this, everything running smoothly and everybody just getting their job done and being happy was just way too boring for her. Way too boring. Now, if you watch that scene, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. It's free on YouTube now, if you want to check it out. All right, let's get into the book. Still on the new era, 1957 to 1964, page 1153. Communist China. Nothing could be more different from the experience of Japan than that of Japan's greatest neighbor, mainland China. On Taiwan, the nationalist government of China has combined the typical Chiang Kai-shek political despotism with an economic program including agrarian reform, somewhat similar to Japan's, but Red China, as far as we can discern, has passed through one great crisis after another in a desperate and tyrannical effort to follow the Stalinist model of Soviet Russia's experience. Like the Soviet Union, Red China may be able to organize itself into a powerful and expanding society, but the problems in China are much greater and more intractable than they were in Russia. For one thing, China's huge population has been placing heavy pressure on limited resources, while Russia has always been an underpopulated country with enormous untapped resources capable of extensive exploitation. Under the Tsar, Russia produced great surpluses, especially of food, which were exported abroad. In a sense, the communist problem in Russia was to re-establish these surpluses, which had been destroyed in the Civil War period of 1917 to 1921, and divert them, along with surplus peasants, to the city to provide capital and labor for the industrialization process. In China, there was no surplus food, so that the problem from the beginning was how to increase the production of food, not how to re-establish it and rechannel it. Moreover, in Russia, the centralized despotic state capable of enforcing these changes was part of the country's past experience. The direct authority of the state in the form of the recruiting officer, the tax collector, and the priest had impinged on the lowest peasant, at least since the abolition of serfdom, and on most of the society for over 1,000 years. In China, as we have seen, the state's authority was remote and separated from the peasants by many layers of semi-autonomous gentry. In China, the authority that impinged on the peasant was social rather than political. The enveloping influence of his family and clan formed the real social unit of the society, which was structured on these units and not on the individual, as in Russia or the West. Moreover, in China, the authority that impinged on the ordinary individual was not only social, it was static, based on custom and tradition rather than on law or political power. Its whole tendency was to resist change. In Russia, on the other hand, the absence of such a binding social nexus, the fact that the basic social and metaphysical reality there was the individual, the fact that the state's power impinged on that individual, and that power for centuries had been seeking change, as it had under Peter or Catherine under Alexander I and II. All these things assisted the establishment of a communist dictatorship in the Soviet Union. Moreover, almost constant internal migration in Russia from its earliest days and the constant threat and reality of war and invasion gave Russia an ability to accept changing personal conditions. This was in the sharpest possible contrast with Chinese conditions, where the heaviest obligation on each family was to maintain its fixed ancestral shrines, an obligation that tied the family to its traditional village. Nowhere was the contrast between Russian and Chinese conditions more emphatic than in religion and general outlook. The Chinese were pragmatic while the Russians were dualistic, and the West was pluralistic. In both the West and in Russia, belief in personal salvation in the hereafter and the need to work or to suffer for such future reward had given the prevailing outlooks a powerful impression of future preference. Moreover, in Russia, the close association of church and state, and the teaching of the former that the latter was an essential element in reality, and that submission to the Tsar's authority was part of the process of future salvation, prepared the way for the future communist system. The dualistic and messianic outlook of Russia prepared Russian minds to accept any kind of uncompromising, intolerant, and painful authority as the only mechanism by which man could be shifted from this level of materialistic deprivation to the other level of salvationist future reward, since man, by his own power, could not cross the metaphysical gap, the no man's land of almost unbridgeable distance between the two levels of Russian dualism. In the West, man could, by his own activity, contribute to raise to a high level of value and reward, because in the West, reality was not dualistic but pluralistic, with an infinite variety of steps and paths formed by the mutual interpenetration of spirit and matter in all the intermediate levels between their two extremes. China had none of this. There, all reality was on the same mundane level. Human activity sought to survive, that is, to retain the existing situation, by pragmatic adaptation and flexible response to shifting pressures. In China, both philosophy and religion were largely ethics, and this ethics was both pragmatic and conservative. In such an environment, the messianic, salvationist, dynamic, future-oriented, state-dominated, abstract, and doctrinaire nature of Marxist-Leninism was utterly alien. Nevertheless, Marxist-Leninism came to China and took control of it. It could not have occurred if the old China had not been almost totally destroyed by the intrusion of the West, by the destruction of Chinese confidence in their way of life in the face of Western power, wealth, and ideology, and by the 60 years of turmoil and war extending from the Japanese attack on China in 1894 to the final communist pacification in 1954. Of course, no people lose their culture completely, no matter how it may disintegrate, and many of the fragments of Chinese cultural patterns continue to persist. One obvious example of this is in foreign policy, where China's patterns were remote from those of the traditional sovereign states, equals in international law found in modern Europe. The Chinese system was always very ethnocentric in that they not only saw themselves as the center of the world, but saw themselves as the only civilized unit in their world picture in a planetary arrangement in which lesser peoples encircled them and lived in increasingly dark barbarism, depending on their distance from Peking. In the traditional view of China by the Chinese, there was, outside the three planetary rings of China itself, the imperial system, the provincial gentry, and the Chinese peasantry, increasingly remote peoples who were dependent upon China for cultural guidance, civilized example, and economic stimulation, and were, in many cases, such as Indochina, Tibet, Mongolia, or Korea, in a tribute paying relationship. This whole relationship, which was quite alien to Europe's idea in the 19th century of the balanced powers of equally foreign states, was, on the contrary, very similar to the modern communist idea of satellite states. It seems likely that the Chinese, in spite of the many good reasons they had to be resentful of the Russians, were willing to be a satellite to the Russian sun until about 1955, when they became increasingly impatient with Khrushchev's efforts to relax the Cold War. These relationships can be seen most clearly in military assistance and economic aid. The Chinese Communists triumphed over Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War with only limited Soviet assistance, since Stalin apparently wanted China to be controlled by a nationalist coalition government in which the communists would participate. Stalin wanted China weak rather than communist, and all his actions seem to have been consistent with this aim. The Russians allowed some of the captured Japanese military equipment to go to the communists in 1945, but this was small in amount compared to that which the communists obtained by capture or purchase from the nationalist forces, and the Soviet Union gave no military aid to the communists during the last 4 years of the Civil War, 1945 to 1949. The Sino-Soviet alliance of February 1950 was accompanied by an economic development loan of $300 million and was followed by the arrival in China of a Soviet military mission of about 3,000 men, but all military aid was sold to China and at high prices. These arms, which were entirely of obsolescent types, cost about $2 billion over 7 years, 1950 to 1957. No effort was made toward coordination of military exercises or training in spite of the alliance of 1950. There was no coordination of air or sea defenses, and China was not brought into the Warsaw Pact. Moreover, the Soviet Union, by its exclusive control of the North Korean army, built it up, launched it into the Korean War, and thus eventually dragged Red China into a war on which they had not been consulted and had no wish to be involved, but were compelled, in defense of their own security, to intervene. Early in 1955, the Soviet Union gave China some moderate help in starting a Chinese military-industrial base, chiefly in the assemblage of light planes, tanks, and naval vessels, but the development of American and Soviet thermonuclear capacity and missiles left China even further behind. In November 1957, Mao Zedong took a delegation to Moscow and made a formal request for nuclear warheads, but was rebuffed. As a result, by 1958, Red China was embarked on the long and difficult task of seeking to make an atomic bomb of its own. This seemed such an impossible job that, almost at once, Mao began to issue public statements belittling nuclear weapons and promising that the enormous numbers of China's militia would be able to survive any nuclear attack. And he's like a conspiracy theorist. He's like, nuclear weapons aren't real. The Quemoy crisis of August to September 1958 showed how little support the Soviet Union would give Red China on that issue, and showed equally how divided the two countries were and how averse the Soviet Union was to China's approach to the brink of war in the Far East. The defensive power of Red China remains very great, chiefly because of its large population and the great distances in which it can maneuver, but its offensive power, except over the minor states on its borders, is small. Military strength in the Far East is still in the hands of the Soviet Union, which has no intention of allowing it to be used in that part of the world, except in the unlikely event that the United States made an all out assault on Red China. Even in that remote case, the Soviet Union's contribution would be limited, and its real strength would continue to be aimed at Europe, to be used there rather than in the Far East. Nonetheless, China's power in world politics does not rest on its own military strength, but on the nuclear stalemate of the Soviet Union and the United States, both of whom are immensely more powerful in a strategic sense than anyone else in the Far East. Under cover of that nuclear stalemate and the high restraint of both superpowers in the use of nuclear weapons, Red China is in a position to engage in local wars, national liberation movements, and anti imperialist guerrilla activities all around its own borders, except along the frontier it has with the Soviet Union itself. These guerrilla adventures by Red China are correlated with the domestic policy rather than with foreign policy, as the Quemoy crisis of summer 1958 was related to the great leap forward of that year. In this correlation of China's domestic and foreign policies, a major role will be played by China's most critical problem, the population food production balance. This problem is probably more acute in China than in any similarly large area in the world. The Communist census of 1953 showed a Chinese population of almost 583 million, considerably more than had been expected. By 1962, this figure may have reached 700 million, with a birth rate of 17 per thousand. China's natural increase was about 2% and gave the country about 1/4 of the world's total population. Only about 1/10 of the land was arable, providing about 270 million acres, or less than an acre of cultivated land for every 2 persons. There has been some small success in increasing the area of cultivated lands, but obviously the problem can be solved only by slowing up the increase in population and by increasing the yields of crops per area of land. There seems to have been little success in either of these over the past decade or so. However, the centralized control of the Peking government over the Chinese people is so strong that it could probably bring the population explosion under control fairly quickly if a decision was made to do so. This would probably be achieved by supplying every woman with a birth control pill at the noon meal each day, since that meal for the majority of Chinese is usually taken in a communal eating place where the process could be controlled as the authorities wished. Wow, he's just gone there with the forced sterilization. The exclusive control of the state over information and public opinion and its ability to mobilize local pressures increases its ability to carry out this policy. This steadily growing crisis was brought abruptly to the acute stage by the Great Leap Forward in 1958, the first year of the second five-year plan. The earlier five-year plan of 1953 to 1957 was based on the similar plan of the Soviet Union. It concentrated on investments in heavy industry with little attention to consumers' goods or agriculture. About $3.5 billion a year, probably 20% of national income, was allotted to investment, with another 16% assigned to the armed forces. If we can believe China's own figures, the plan was a success, with output of coal, electricity, cement, and machine tools doubled and production of steel tripled. Total production of these commodities still left China largely unindustrialized, but by 1957, the government controlled 70% of all industry, 85% of retail trade, and almost all banking, foreign, and wholesale trade. In the first five-year plan, China was almost totally lacking in trained personnel and was dependent for these, as well as for necessary equipment, on foreign sources. This could be found only within the Soviet bloc, but were not provided freely and had to be paid for with settlement of accounts and new yearly agreements on annual basis. The severity of the Soviets' terms on aid to China were in sharp contrast to its more generous behavior towards some of China's lesser neighbors and must have had an adverse influence on China's attitude towards Moscow even from the beginning. However, the necessary help could not be obtained elsewhere, and the achievement of the first Chinese 5-year plan rested on this assistance. In addition to the loan of $300 million in 1950, the Soviet Union in 1953 to 1956 agreed to sell China $2 billion in equipment and several thousand technical advisors to help build 211 major industrial projects. On this basis, the first 5-year plan achieved an annual rate of increase in production of at least 6%. The effort was financed very largely by accumulation of surplus agricultural commodities from China's hard-pressed peasantry and exchange of these for petroleum, machinery, and other commodities needed for the industrialization of China. Since these came largely from the Soviet Union and the European communist satellites, 80% of China's trade was with the communist bloc at the end of this first 5-year plan. It is possible that this process could have continued, but it is even more likely that the faster rate of increase of population in comparison with the rise in food production may have indicated that the process could not continue. In any case, the powers in Peking decided to do something about it, although it is not completely clear what they decided to do, and even less clear why they decided to do it. The consequence was a disaster. The Great Leap Forward of 1958 became a great stumble. This was the third stage in the agrarian reorganization of China. The first stage in agrarian reform had been the elimination of landlordism in 1950 to 1952. Previous to the land reform law of June 1950, 10% of families owned 53% of the farmland, while 32% owned 78% of the land. This left over 2/3 of such families, 58%, with only 22% of the land. The landlords were eliminated with great brutality in a series of spectacular public trials in which landlords were accused of every crime in the book. At least 3 million were executed and several times that number were imprisoned, according to the official figures, but the total of both groups may have been much higher. The land thus obtained was distributed to poor peasant families, with each obtaining about 1/3 of an acre. The second stage in the agrarian reform, 1955, sought to establish cooperative farming. In effect, it took away from the peasants the lands they had just obtained. The argument for forming collectives was persuasive. Most peasant holdings were too small to work effectively, since abundant fertilizers, new crops and methods, specialized tools, and efficient land management could not be used on the average peasant farm of half an acre. To permit such improvements in farm practices, the peasants were forced into cooperatives. By the end of 1956, 83% of the peasants, or 125 million families, had to join into 750,000 cooperatives. The third stage of agrarian reform, constituting the basic feature of the Great Leap Forward, merged the 750,000 collective farms into about 26,000 agrarian communities of about 5,000 families each. This was a social rather than simply an agrarian revolution, since its aims included the destruction of the family household and the peasant village. All activities of the members, including child rearing, education, entertainment, Social life, the militia, and all economic and intellectual life came under the control of the commune. In some areas, the previous villages were destroyed and the peasants were housed in dormitories with communal kitchens and mess halls, nurseries for the children, and separation of these children under the commune's control and isolation from their parents at an early age. One purpose of this drastic change was to release large numbers of women from domestic activities so they could do labor in fields or factories. I guess the communists were into feminism too. In the first year of the Great Leap Forward, 90 million peasant women were relieved of their domestic duties and became available to work for the state. In many cases, factories and craft centers were established in the communes to use this labor, manufacturing goods not only for the commune but for sale in the outside market. One of the chief aims of this total reorganization of rural life was to make available for savings and investments surpluses of agricultural income from the rural sector of Chinese society in order to build up the industrial sector. The regime estimated that it could reverse the previous division of agricultural incomes, under which 70% was consumed by the agricultural population and only 30% was available to the non-agricultural sectors of Chinese society. At the same time, it was expected that the communes would totally shatter the resistant social structure of Chinese society, leaving isolated individuals to face the power of the state. Finally, it was expected that these isolated individuals could be mobilized along military lines to carry out agricultural duties in squads and platoons assigned to specific fields and tasks. This last expectation, at least, was mistaken. The Great Leap Forward did not increase agricultural output, but on the contrary, reduced it drastically despite the extravagant estimates of increases in production that were issued by officials towards the end of the first year. So you can't just make a law that says farmers are going to increase crops or productivity. You actually have to let the farmers increase productivity by reducing taxes and all types of other overhead stuff. Officially, the agricultural disasters of 1958 to 1962 were attributed to unfavorable climate conditions, including unprecedented droughts, floods, storms, and insect pests, but the reversal of the Great Leap's plans and priorities in 1960 to 1961 shows that the Chinese themselves recognize the organizational element as contributing to their farming problems. Yes, central planning. It is undoubtedly true that adverse climate contributed to the difficulties, and it may well be true that such climate conditions in the 19th century might have resulted in far greater want and famine than did actually occur in 1958 to 1962, for the communist government was not involved in corruption, self-enrichment, and calculated inefficiency as earlier Chinese governments were, and had both greater power and greater desire to operate a fair rationing system. But the fact remains that in China, as in other communist states, including the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, the inability of a communized agricultural system to produce sufficient food surpluses to support a thoroughly communized industrial system at a high rate of expansion is now confirmed. So basically what he's saying is centralized planning doesn't work. On the other hand, the need for all these communist regimes to purchase grain from the bulging agricultural surpluses of the Western countries, including Australia, Canada, the United States, and even Europe, confirms the fact that there is something in the Western pattern of living, but not necessarily in its economic organization, which does provide a bountiful agricultural system. The details of the Chinese agricultural fiasco are not yet clear. It would appear that the Chinese diet, in which at least 3/4 of food is carbohydrates and statistically recorded as grain, even when it may be potatoes, requires a basic survival diet of at least 2,000 calories a day, with at least 1,500 calories from grain. For a population of 700 million people, this requires a minimum crop of 180 million metric tons of grain a year, a figure that leaves nothing for reserves or for the inevitable inefficiencies of maldistribution through the inadequate Chinese transport system. Moreover, this crop must increase each year to provide for the annual population increase of 2%, which gave 14 million more mouths in 1962. The official estimates for 1958 grain crop were originally set at over 300 million tons, but in 1959 and later, this was revised to less than 250 million tons. It was probably less than 200 million. The crop for 1959 was even less, perhaps 190 million tons, while that for 1960 may have been 150 million tons. These three adverse years undoubtedly used up all China's grain reserves, and the Chinese purchases of grain in the world's market, beginning with about 10 million tons in 1961, may have been to rebuild some reserves rather than to provide a minimal increase for the average hungry Chinaman. It seems clear that the average diet of urban Chinese over these 3 harsh years may have fallen as low as 1,400 calories a day, at least 600 below the level that permits steady effective work. The impact of the Chinese food crisis of 1958 to 1962 extended into all aspects of Chinese life and policy, including foreign affairs. This process was intensified from the fact that the Great Leap Forward from the beginning involved much more than the reorganization of China's agriculture. It also included a considerable decentralization of economic management of China as a whole, from centralized technical experts to local party and working leaders. There was a considerable increase in the influence of the Communist Party in contrast to the state bureaucracy, and there was the general shift from emphasis on heavy industrial investment to more short-range economic objectives. It seems likely that there was also a change in economic accounting from emphasis on output to emphasis on the profits accumulation of individual enterprises. You mean like capitalism? Some of these changes were undoubtedly steps in the right direction, but they were lost to view under the general failures of agricultural production in 1958 to 1961. This failure reacted on industrial production by curtailing both investment and labor, so that output from this sector of the economy may have fallen by half. At the same time, China's reduced ability to export raw materials and agricultural products simply because they cannot be spared, and the need to make bulk purchases of food, especially grain, in Australia, Canada, or elsewhere, brought China face to face with a great shortage of foreign exchange and made it almost impossible for China to purchase necessary equipment abroad. China received little help from the Soviet Union during these difficult years. The repayment of loans to Russia continued and was, if anything, speeded up in spite of the terrible burden they placed on the Chinese economy. Soviet imports from China were 793 million rubles in 1958 and 990 million in 1959, but fell to 496 million rubles in 1961. Soviet exports to China, which were 859 million rubles in 1959, were down to 331 million rubles in 1961. As a result, Sino-Soviet trade as a whole had a total balance favorable to China, in the sense that China received more than it gave to Russia. Of the 984 million rubles over 6 years, 1950 to 1955, but had a total balance unfavorable to China of 750 million rubles over 6 years, 1956 to 1961. The Soviet Union advanced no development credits to China in these difficult years, as it was doing to Mongolia, North Korea, and North Vietnam at the same time, but collected payment on China's debts to do it exactly as if no Chinese food crisis were occurring. The Soviet Union exported 6.8 million tons of grain to other countries in 1960 and 7.5 million tons in 1961, but none to China. On the contrary, China's debt obligations made it necessary for it to ship over $250 million in agricultural exports to Russia in 1960, at the same time it was paying out over $300 million of hard-earned foreign exchange for grain from Western countries. The Soviet attitude was business is business, an agreement is an agreement, and the economic development of the Soviet Union itself cannot be sacrificed for the sake of a heretical member of the communist bloc. In 1960, the Soviet Union made some minor concessions to China's difficulties, including release of 500,000 tons of Cuban sugar to China from the total due to Russia, to be repaid in sugar later, and the sale of 300,000 tons of Soviet grain to China, only about 5% of China's foreign grain purchase of that year. The withdrawal of almost all Soviet technical and military advisors in China during the summer of 1960 could not be defended solely on the basis of good business practice, and marked one of the major steps on the continued deterioration of Sino-Soviet relations. It also established the almost complete dependence of China on its own resources, supplemented by whatever it could get wherever it could get it, for building up its economic system. As one symbol of that situation, it might be noted that trade with communist bloc had at its peak accounted for over 80% of China's total foreign trade, but by 1962 it had fallen below 50%. The food crisis in Red China is apparently chronic, as it is, to a lesser degree, in all communist countries. For example, in May 1962, not a year in which the crisis was generally acute, 70,000 hungry Chinese pushed across the barricaded border of China into the booming British colony of Hong Kong during the month. This intrusion was apparently caused by some local food maldistribution within China. It is not clear why the Chinese border guards permitted this worldwide revelation of its agricultural failure, although it might have been part of an effort to overwhelm and suffocate Hong Kong's booming prosperity, which must be as unacceptable on China's border as the prosperity of West Germany or West Berlin is to communist East Germany. Although the Soviet Union did not take advantage of China's food crisis in 1958 to 1962, to wage direct economic warfare on its fellow communist regime, its business-like indifference to all appeals of fellowship or even humanitarian considerations undoubtedly intensified the alienation of the two countries, which had begun much earlier and on quite different grounds. This alienation of the world's two greatest areas of communist rule began in the earliest days of the Red Chinese regime and was bound to become an open schism sooner or later. From the simple fact of balance of power, the one political event the Soviet Union had to fear was the appearance of a new superpower adjacent to the Soviet Union on the landmass of Eurasia. The only possibilities for such a development would be a unified Western Europe or a powerful China, with India as a much more remote and unlikely possibility. In the second place, Communist China's need for technical and economic assistance were inevitably so great that they directly compete with the Soviet Union's need for its own resources for its own development. Whatever China obtained from this nature from Russia could hardly fail, in the long run, to become a source of bitter feelings. In the third place, from the beginning, a fissure between the two was inevitable because, to the Soviet Union, Europe was the primary area of concern, while to China, the Far East was primary. Each power inevitably felt that the other should support it in its primary areas and ease off pressures in the areas of its own primary concern, an assumption about as realistic as any could be. Thus, Red China resented the Soviet Union's attempts to work up crisis over Berlin as deeply as Moscow resented Peking's effort to work up crisis over Taiwan. As we shall see in a moment, China's aggressive foreign policy in the Far East extended far beyond Taiwan to all of the border areas that had once been tributary to Peking. The fourth source of discord arose from the fact that the two communist powers were at quite different stages on the road to socialism. The basic question in the allotment of economic resources in any state is concerned with the division of such resources among the three sectors: governmental, especially defense; two, investment in capital and equipment; and three, consumers' goods for rising standards of living. In Stalin's day, the Soviet Union placed major emphasis on 1 and 2 at the expense of 3, but under Khrushchev, there have been increasing pressures to shift the allotment of resources towards 3. Red China, which is at least 40 years behind the Soviet Union in the development process, must emphasize the first two sectors and can obtain the resources to do this only from curtailed consumption. Thus, it must look at its problems from the point of view much closer to Stalin than Khrushchev, a difference that led to alienation when Khrushchev began to attack Stalinism in 1956. Closely related to this fourth source of friction was a fifth: the monolithic quality of the Marxist-Leninist states. By 1960, the Soviet Union's experience in Europe, especially with Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Poland, clearly demonstrated that communist states had their individual characteristics and rhythms of development and could not all be ruled from one center. This necessity by 1960 was being hailed in Moscow under the name socialist polycentrism, but was unacceptable in Peking under any name. At first, Peking wanted the monolithic solidarity for which it yearned to be operated from Moscow under discussion by all communist states. But by 1960, it was clear that if a communist monolith were to be created, it would have to be done by Peking itself. A sixth source of alienation between Moscow and Peking is rather difficult to document, but may well be more important than the others. It is concerned with a growing recognition by China, if not by the Soviet Union, that the Kremlin was being driven, under a multitude of pressures, towards a policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States, not as a temporary tactical maneuver, which would have been acceptable to China, but as a semi-permanent policy. Part of this policy involved the Soviet attitude towards the fundamental theories of Marxist-Leninism, especially on the Leninist side. These theories had envisioned the advanced capitalist states as approaching a condition of economic collapse from the internal contradictions of capitalism itself. According to the theory, this crisis would be reflected in two aspects: the continued impoverishment of the working class in advanced industrial countries, with consequent growth of violence of the class struggle in such countries, and increasing violence of the imperialist aggression of such countries towards each other in struggles to control more backwards areas as markets for the industrial products that the continued impoverishment of their own workers made impossible to sell in the domestic market. Huh. The falseness of these theories was fully evident in the rising standard of living of the advanced industrial countries, and especially in the ones such as West Germany or the United States, which were most capitalistic in their orientation. It was also evident in the willingness of Britain, the United States, and others to see the end of colonialism in Asia and Africa. This evidence of the errors of Marxist-Leninist theories was increasingly clear to the Kremlin, although it could not be admitted, but it was quite unclear to Peking, whose leaders were almost totally ignorant of the conditions of the non-communist world. None of the chief Chinese leaders had any first-hand knowledge of the outside world, and indeed, in most cases, had never been outside China at all, except for a couple of quick visits to the Soviet Union late in life. As a consequence, the Chinese communist leaders were ignorant, dogmatic, doctrinaire, and rigid. These attitudes appeared clearly within China in the fading of the Hundred Flowers campaign of 1957. In theory, the communist system, after the elimination of Trotsky, accepted free discussion of goals and means until a decision on these had been reached by the primary machinery, when discussion must stop and the decision be carried out with full loyalty. This procedure had never been observed under the tyrannical rule of the Kremlin and was less likely to be followed in Peking. In 1956, however, Mao Zedong announced a new policy of free criticism of the regime. As he said, let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. This was a period of ideological confusion in the world communist movement, which looked back on the struggle in the Kremlin to establish Stalin's successor, was still reeling from Khrushchev's anti-Stalin speech at the 20th Party Congress, and late in 1956 was called upon to face revolts against the Kremlin in Budapest and Warsaw. Although Zhou Enlai, the foreign minister of Red China, rushed to Europe to extend his country's support to Khrushchev in this power struggle, ideological confusion was everywhere within the communist world, and Mao was undoubtedly concerned with the solid basis for his own power and the problems of establishing a rule of succession in Peking. In February 1957, Mao gave a speech to a large conference on the subject of the correct handling of contradictions among the people. It was not published until June, but in the interval gave rise to the Hundred Flowers controversy. In his speech, Mao invited criticism and free discussion within the structure of the existing communist state system. He promised immunity to critics so long as their criticisms contributed to the unity of Red China. These restrictive phrases were widely ignored, and in a few weeks, widespread and often fundamental criticisms of the regime were being voiced in meetings, the press, and especially in educational institutions. The three evils that Mao had mentioned, bureaucracy, dogmatism, and sectarianism, were being freely denounced, with the Communist Party cadres the chief targets. Some critics suggested that the proper solution to these problems was to permit the establishment of a legal opposition party within some kind of parliamentary system. The general consensus of the complaint was aimed at the lack of freedom to speak out, to move about, to disagree, or to publish. On June 8th, the government's counterattack began, at first relatively moderately, but with increasing insistence. The principle of free criticism was not revoked, but the publication of Mao's February speech on June 17th set the limits that had presumably always been in effect. Within a year, there had been a considerable shakeup of party and state personnel. Many discontented persons, revealed by their criticism, had been removed or disciplined in various ways, and all rightists had been eliminated. The chief punishment was public denunciation and personal criticism of these discontented, but undoubtedly punishment in many cases went much further than that. One sequel to the Hundred Flowers criticism was a reorganization of the upper ranks of the party and government and the provision of a succession to Mao. Mao Zedong, son of a peasant who became wealthy on speculation and money lending, was born in 1893 in Hunan province. His father, a domestic tyrant and local miser, had less than 4 acres, but used the labor of his 3 sons and hired hand to work them. He gave his sons a basic education, but his personal despotism drove his whole family into alliance against him. Young Mao's early life thus was one of severe discipline, constant domestic strife, and secret dreams of rebellion. By paying for a substitute worker in his own stead on the family land, he was able to get away to study for 5 years in Hunan Normal School, finished in 1918. There he read deeply in Chinese history, especially military history, and formed a discussion group on large social questions. Becoming an employee of the library of Peking National University, he continued his reading, discussion, and self-education, and in 1920 was one of the 11 original founders of the Chinese Communist Party, CCP. Until 1953, Mao's position in the CCP was that of a dissident, and he was more than once reprimanded and demoted or removed from the party position. His chief difficulty was that he refused to accept the party's official view, insisted on by Russian-trained communist leaders, that the revolution must be based on urban industrial workers, the real proletariat. Instead, Mao envisioned the party as a tightly disciplined group that could be raised to power on the revolutionary activities of the great mass of impoverished and discontented peasantry. Closely related to this idea were the 2 others that were equally unorthodox. One, the role of rural guerrilla warfare in wearing down and ultimately defeating a reactionary government, and 2, a fundamental emphasis on the distinction between imperialist and colonial nations. This last point made it possible for Mao to regard the backward and undeveloped colonial areas as possible areas of revolutionary activity, where, as in China, the exploited peasants could provide the revolutionary impetus and could defend their revolutionary achievements by guerrilla warfare. The more orthodox communist line was that a revolution could be carried out only by an urban proletariat that could be found only in an advanced industrial area, and that such an industrial base was essential to provide the modern military equipment needed to defend the revolutionary achievement against the counterattacks of aggressive capitalist countries. In a sense, Mao was much closer to the realities of modern politics and to the experience of Soviet Russia itself, since it is perfectly clear that no advanced industrial nation will go communist and that the movement must make its advances in underdeveloped areas if it is to be successful anywhere. Since the objections to Mao's position came from the center of world communist theory in Moscow, Mao distinguished between the Russian and Chinese experience by calling Russia an ex-imperialist country and China an ex-colonial country. In fact, however, they both became communist while still backwards countries, and did so as a consequence of invasion and defeat of the established government in a foreign war. Thus, Mao's interpretation, while possibly erroneous in its belief that the revolutionary regime comes to power by guerrilla warfare supported by discontented peasantry, may well be correct based on the Russian precedent that communist regimes are more likely to come to power in backward states and will survive there if they are able to use the state's despotic power to direct the utilization of economic resources towards investment to provide a high rate of economic development, as Soviet Russia has done. Red China, like Soviet Russia, is governed under a parallel structure of the party and the government in which successive layers of assemblies and committees build up from the local level to the central authority. Until 1959, Mao held the chairmanship at the peak of both party and government. As a first step toward establishing a succession that would not repeat the desperate intrigue and violence that had occurred in the Kremlin following Stalin's death, he resigned from the chairmanship of the Republic in favor of Liu Shaoqi, but retained his position as chairman of the Central Committee of the party. The third man in the system, Chao En-lai, is a member of the 7-man standing committee that controls the party, has been premier of the government since 1949, and was also a foreign minister in 1949 to 1958. While the structure of the governmental system of Red China is very similar to that of Soviet Russia, its spirit seems quite different. This is reflected in two ways. In Russia, the old Bolsheviks of the early days of the party were all eliminated, mostly by violent death, in the internecine power struggles which went on behind the grim walls of the Kremlin, while the Politburo throughout maintained a monolithic, impassive face to the outside world. In Red China, most of the party leaders of today are still those who came together to engage in the earliest revolutionary struggles of the party in the 1920s. Moreover, they have, over the past 40 years, been differed and even engaged in violent struggles and controversies with each other, but always were able to continue to work together and to patch up their differences. The real distinction here is that the Kremlin has always insisted on presenting to the outside world a picture of itself as united and infallible. This is why Khrushchev's speech at the 20th Party Congress attacking Stalin was such a shock to the world. But the Chinese party leadership has never hesitated to admit that it has often been divided and fallible. Even Mao has changed his ideas and admitted his errors. Moreover, this apparently can be done without any need to punish or to liquidate the fallible comrades. The key to this rather insignificant difference in the tone of communist government in Moscow and Peking may be found in the two basic distinctions, a difference of outlook and a difference of procedure. In Russia, the ancient doctrinaire and rigidly idealistic tone associated with traditional Russian outlook and the traditional Russian religious system, both going back to their roots in Greek rationalism and Zoroastrian religion, establish patterns of ideology that have continued under materialistic and atheistic communism. Such attitudes are foreign to the traditions of Chinese pragmatism. Moreover, the origins of Chinese communist organization and discussion groups in which all those present recognized their own ignorance and inadequacy of their information on social facts, as well as on Marxist dogma, has continued in the practice of almost endless party meetings on all levels, filled with discussion, debate, and individual examination of one's own position and attitudes. As one remarkable consequence of these differences between China and the Soviet Union, there are at least half a dozen legal, minor political parties in Red China today. These not only exist and are permitted to participate in the governing process in a very minor way, but they are subject to no real efforts at forcible suppression, although they are subject to persistent, rather gentle efforts at conversion. Such efforts would, of course, change to ruthless reprisal if these tamed minor parties made any real effort to change or destroy the position of the Communist Party itself. These differences between communism in China and the Soviet Union may be explained most readily in terms of the different traditions of the two countries. The same applies to their different foreign policies, to which we have already referred. All right. Gonna stop reading there for today. Not much really going on here. They're just kind of comparing Chinese communist development with Russian communist development, and there's not really much there, to be honest. It's just kind of like, well, China's a different country, different resources, different people, different history. So they did it a different way. But again, I think the chapter just keeps reiterating the fact that communism just does not work in a productive capacity. Central planning, just writing a law saying, oh, well, farmers must produce 300 million tons of grain this year. That's not how it works. Like, you have to let the farmers run the farms, get the equipment, make their profits so they have an incentive to do it. And then it makes everything go a lot better, as we can see in Europe and Americas. So that's it for this video today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.